Amen. So it's Christmas. Here's the good news. The good news is that Christmas does not, contrary to popular opinion, last for one day. Christmas lasts for 12 days. That's the season of Christmas. In the strange way that the church tells time in the church's calendar, Christmas lasts for 12 days. This is day one. So you've got 11 more days of this to go on. So for the little kids, that's really good news. 11 days of getting presents from mum and dad. Sorry. But it's really a good thing. Now, usually when the church has something going on and it lasts for a certain period of time, the numbers all mean something. You know, in the life of a church, everything means something. Everything points to something other than what it really is itself. So the 12 in the 12 days of Christmas, I got excited about that, and I thought, I wonder where that comes from. What's the significance? Like, say, we talk about Moses being in the desert for 40 years, and then Jesus goes into the desert for 40 days. And after a while, you start thinking, this number 40 keeps cropping up. It must mean something. How about the number 12? Turns out there's a very practical reason why Christmas lasts for 12 days. And that to figure that out, you have to sort of look back into the glory days of the Roman Empire. At the time of Jesus, it was huge. It stretched, across much of the known world. It was so big that at one end of the empire, people measured time using a lunar calendar where the moon is, tells you what time it is. And at the other end, they measured time by where the sun is. The consequence of that is that at certain times of the year, depending on where you are, the day can be different by up to 12 days, depending on where the moon and the sun are positioned. So that's quite an extraordinary thing, right? So what that meant was in the Roman Empire, you'd have a group of people in one place celebrating Christmas on one day, and a group over here celebrating it a week later, and somebody else over here celebrating it at a different time. And the Romans didn't like stuff like that because they liked everything to be neat and orderly and everything lined up. It took a while. It was, I think, the year 567 AD, at the Council of Tours. They sat down and looked at all of this and said, what are we going to do? And somebody said, I have an idea. Let's just make Christmas last for the whole 12 days. And that way, wherever you are, it'll be Christmas. They said, great idea. So that's what they did. And that's where the 12 days of Christmas comes from. It comes from there. And now, as the years went on from 567, every single day throughout those 12 has some sort of significance to it. So today, of course, is Christmas Day, birth of Jesus. Tomorrow is St. Stephen's Day. The next day is the feast of St. John the Evangelist, the only one of the disciples who's believed not to have died as a martyr. The fourth day is the feast of the Holy Innocents. You might remember in the story of the birth of Jesus that nasty piece of work, Herod sends his soldiers out and they kill a lot of little children, trying to make sure that they get Jesus. They don't, but they try. And so there's all of these innocent children who are killed, and that's remembered on the Feast of the Holy Innocents. And then you keep going through all of these feasts until you get to the end. You get to Epiphany. Epiphany is the day in which we usually celebrate the Magi showing up at the birth of Jesus, these people who come from the east and follow a star, the first Gentiles to come in and recognize this Jewish child as being spectacularly important. That's Epiphany. They had an Epiphany moment. So that's what those days are all about, but usually we just know it through the song. So we kind of had some fun at our house recently. We did a little thing. We had a lot of family there, and so we wrote out the verses of 12 Days of Christmas, chopped them up into pieces of paper, gave them out to everybody. And then the person who had day one started to sing, and then the person who had day two had to chip in with their word, and then day three and day four, and it turned into a riot in no time at all. It's the funniest thing ever. But the song, the 12 Days of Christmas, which you probably know, every single thing in the song means something. They all point to something other than what they're actually named, all of them. So if you start thinking about that, it starts off with a partridge in a pear tree, right? Partridge in a pear tree. The partridge is known as the bird that if you get too close to its nest, it'll sort of flop down on the ground before you, put its wing out as if it's broken, and shuffle along on the floor, willing to sacrifice itself to protect its babies. So that points to, that's a Jesus figure, right? Somebody who's willing to do that. Willing to lay its life down for the sake of something else. So day 1, a partridge in a pear tree. Day 2, 2 turtle doves. 2 turtle doves represent the 2 books of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Day 3, 3 French hens. Those represent the theological virtues. In the life of a church, there are 2 different types of virtues. Theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, are things who have God as their object. And then there are other types of virtues that are directed out more at people. But these are the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, the 3 French hens. And then the 4 calling birds, of course, would be the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the 5 golden rings would be the 5 books of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The 6 geese are laying, the 6 days of creation. The 7 swans are swimming are the 7-fold gifts of the Holy Spirit by which the Spirit of God empowers people to live in the world. The 8 maids are milking represent the 8 beatitudes, the 8 blessings that Jesus delivers during the Sermon on the Mount. All those sayings that start, "Blessed are you who," and it carries on from there. The 9 ladies dancing are the 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit. Actually, they fiddled with this a little bit because I don't think that you'd really find 9 if you actually read through the New Testament. I think you'd probably find 12, and they collapse some of them together. But anyway, the idea is good. 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit, and then the 10 lords a leaping, of course, would be the 10 commandments, the 10 words. The 11 pipers piping, the 11 faithful apostles or disciples. Remember, there was the one who fell away. And then 12, the 12 drummers drumming. It ends with the 12 points of belief that are listed in the Apostles' Creed. So that funny little song is actually all about pointing at different parts of faith and life. So that's really extraordinary. So there are 11 signs that point to the partridge in the pear tree, the Jesus on day 1. Here, all of the rest of them are signs that point that way. They point to, as the reading said, that the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we've seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And everything else points to that one figure. So the point of all of that, why does it do that, is in order that all people experience the light. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The all part is important there. All people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. So on dark days, it's important to remember that the darkness does not overcome the light. That's the message of the Gospels. And that Jesus comes to bring life, and that life is light not just for one group of people, but for all people. So, that was always the point of the whole story. The whole story always. John's Gospel starts with the words, "in the beginning," and it reiterates that later by saying he was in the beginning. And as you know, the entire biblical narrative starts in Genesis with the words, "in the beginning." John's Gospel is designed to reinforce the idea that the story was always set in a certain direction. And John's Gospel says that he, the Word, was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. And more about that in just a moment here. What does it mean to come into being? Coming into being doesn't mean just any old thing. Coming into being is about becoming more and more like God, recovering the image of God in a person's life. And John describes that by saying he gave power to become children of God. You become like the image of God as you live through your life. So, being a child of God, then, is all about taking the idea of who Jesus was and is and making that part of who you are. We use the word incarnation for that. It literally means in a piece of meat, which doesn't sound very nice. But what it really means is the idea to be inside you, to have Jesus, the spark of the light inside you, and carry that out into the world, is to live it. And so we read in Hebrews, he is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. Somebody being imprinted with the very image of God. And that's how we're intended to live our lives. Learning to love with our whole being, not just with our words. People sometimes think that if you just say something nice to someone, that it counts. Well, I guess it counts, but not much. Much better if you learn to love somebody with your whole being, with your actions as well as your words, right? That's important. So, the idea of incarnation, which is what we celebrate today, God coming into the world in the person of Jesus, that's incarnation. The whole story goes all of the way through to learning to love with our whole being and not just with our words. And so on Easter, when we talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus, what we're talking about there is that Jesus comes face to face with the bad guys of the world. In his day, that was the Roman Empire. And they say to him, really very simply, listen, if you'll just stop going around talking about being light in the darkness, if you'll just blow the light out and just go off and live a quiet life, we'll leave you alone. But he decides he will say his message with his whole being. And so he says, no, I won't do that. And you know what happens then, right? If you say that sort of thing to the Roman Empire, that's how you wind up getting nailed to something. And that's exactly what happens in the story here. He learned to love humankind with his whole being. It was that important to him. So, learning to love with your whole being. I said this last night in our Christmas Eve service here. Jesus seems to have a very clear idea of what it means to love. And in Jesus' day, remember that love is not an emotion. He's not talking about falling in love. Love is a choice. It's a way you choose to live your life. And when he's asked about this, he responds by taking two pieces of his own ancient writings, what we'd call the Old Testament, putting them together and quoting them. And he says, this is what it means. It means that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, how important are those things? On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Everything else is subsidiary to the idea of loving God and loving neighbor as you love yourself. All of it. There's also another thing that Jesus teaches about, which is loving strangers. He doesn't mention it here because, in my opinion, it was so obvious to him that he didn't need to keep saying it to people. The idea that we love people who are on the outside and who come in, strangers in the biblical narrative. So, the 12 days of Christmas, of which this is day one, I like to think about this as sort of our very own personal 12-step program, 12-step program that can lead you from one place in your life to another place in your life. So let me explain to you how I think that works, just very briefly. Of course, you can't do it in 12 days, really. It's symbolic of a series of steps that a person can take in their life that will lead them from one place to another place. So it starts off by having to recognize that love came down at Christmas. And that this is something that came from outside. It wasn't something that came from within. It wasn't something that we have our own power over to bring about. It's something that came from the outside and came in, and it's about a commitment to make love real in the world today. Step one. Step two is your invitation to become part of God's great story. The biblical narrative is not a book of rules. It is not a book of morals. It is God's narrative, God's story for God's people. And if you pick up a Bible and open it, you will discover that the last page in every Bible I've ever seen is blank. And why do you think that is? It's so you can write your part that comes next here. You're invited to become part of God's great story from the Old Testament through to the New Testament. And you're invited, through understanding where that story goes and how it works, to work towards living a life characterized by faith, by hope, and most importantly, by love. Remember, the greatest of these is love. And then, importantly, to remember, if you read through the 4 Gospels here, the 4 calling birds, what do you learn? One of the things you learn is that everybody's encounter of Jesus is a little bit different. Just because somebody's encounter isn't the same as yours, it doesn't mean that they're wrong and you're right, or the other way around. Everybody's encounter is a little bit different. People encounter the Word made flesh in lots of different ways. Understanding the very start of the story, the beginning, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, they're kind of tough. In particular, people will often tell me they've decided they're going to read the Bible, and they start at the beginning, and they'll read through Genesis, and they'll make it through Exodus, and then they get to Leviticus. And then if they make it through that, they almost certainly don't make it through Numbers, because it's just... But that's because if you try and read it as a textbook, it's just brutally difficult. Instead, if you see it as a flow of a narrative for a group of people that you're invited to connect with, then it's different here. So seeing how it starts is important. In particular, the very, very, very beginning, the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1 through 3, they're described really twice here, talks about how being became possible. This is one of those things that people get very excited about often in negative ways, when we start to talk about, say, where does everything come from? And that's a question that theologically is not how did it come into being, but what makes being possible. That's an entirely different question, what makes being possible. And as far as I'm aware, there's only one possible answer to that question here. But I'll let you read it for yourself and you can decide. 7 Swans of Swimming is about you being empowered by the Spirit of God to change the world, starting with yourself. Change yourself, change the world. That's how it goes. And being empowered by God to do that. The 8 Maids of Milking is, remember, a reference to Jesus' Beatitudes, or Macarisms as they're called, where Jesus talks about what it means to be blessed or to be thankful here. There are so many things that we just take for granted. It's astonishing, really, isn't it, when you think about it? You look around you at the world, and if you think none of it had to be this way, none of it. It didn't have to come into being at all. But it did. And not only did it come into being, but it came into being in such a way that you can see things like, say, a single red rose, and think, oh, that's beautiful. That's an astonishing thing. How does that happen? That's what coming into being is about, and it's what being blessed is about. And then learning to live a fruitful and meaningful life is important here. A life characterized by gentleness and patience and kindness and goodness and joy. That's important too, and it's a way of starting to live a different kind of life, allowing the words of God to be written on your heart. Important message from the entire biblical narrative. It says in the end that a person who is transformed by God, you don't need a book of rules. You don't need to go and consult a list of rules about how to live your life, because you will already know, because it will be written deeply within you. You won't have to have somebody tell you, oh, it's wrong to steal from your neighbor, because the idea would never occur to you, because you have become a different person here. The words of God have been written into you. Whoops, I went too fast. Being faithful matters. One of the things you learn from the biblical narrative, Jesus starts off with 12 disciples. It doesn't work out well with one of them. People sometimes slip away and fall off the track, and that happens here. So working to try and stay on the path, stay on the track, being faithful is really important. And then finally, keeping the main thing the main thing. That's what the Apostles' Creed is about. How do you keep the main thing the main thing? Well, first of all, you have to know what the main thing is. And Jesus tells you what the main thing is. It's about loving each other and loving God, about loving our neighbor as you love yourself and loving the stranger. That's the main thing. Jesus tells you that. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Everything else is subsidiary to that idea. That's the main thing. So, now in Methodism, this is a Methodist church, There's a mantra that's used here. It's often attributed incorrectly to the founder of the Methodist movement, John Wesley, who lived in the 1700s. You'll see this quote with his name underneath, but he never actually wrote this. But it's a good mantra, and we use it a lot in Methodist churches. What should you do in your life? Well, you should do this. You should do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. That's about loving each other. It's really about what the whole purpose of being the church is. Learning to love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself, learning to love the stranger, learning to love the environment and the planet and so on. If we could all just do that, I think the world would be a much, much better place. And that's the message that Jesus, whose birth we celebrate today, came to deliver to us. Doesn't sound that hard, does it? Why are we so bad at it? Why are we so bad at it? Surely we can do better. The Word became flesh and lived among us. That's the message. Merry Christmas, one and all.